I sometimes get into discussion with my colleagues from other traditions. And in the course of a lively discussion with a Presbyterian minister about faith, I said, well, really, Unitarian Universalists are more faithful than you Presbyterians. And he said, that can't possibly be. And I said, yes, it is, because we have the offering before the sermon. We don't know what we're paying for. I'll try to earn the money, do my best here. I'm an atheist now, but I grew up in a pretty traditional Christian household. Our family would sometimes hold Bible readings at the kitchen table in the evening, and those times to me went deeper than just the words on the page. They meant that there was more to the cosmos than just what I wanted or what I knew or what I happened to be thinking about. One favorite passage was the Sermon on the Mount from the Gospel according to Matthew, and scholars agree that gospel, the whole gospel, was written about 50 years after Jesus was killed, and the person who wrote the Gospel of Matthew probably never met Jesus. But the Sermon on the Mount probably does express the ethical center of what Jesus actually taught. That's the consensus anyway. And of course, the most stirring part of the Sermon on the Mount is the passage known as the Beatitudes, which I read earlier, both as poetry and as a clarion call to higher ethics. The Beatitudes are some of the most meaningful writing in the whole Bible. To me, whether a person's an atheist or a theist, they're about all the theology you really need. But of course, the Beatitudes go against the grain of human nature. There is a shadow side to us, and the Beatitudes challenge that shadow. It takes insight and self-discipline and a lot of compassion and generosity to step beyond group dynamics and instinct and self-interest to reflect what we might call an ethic of divine love, which is what Jesus actually taught. In my view, watching so many evangelical Christians line up to promote the most violent aspects of human nature, frankly, we can see how easy it is to call oneself a Christian while totally abandoning Christian ethics. Just my opinion, but I have long observed that it is way too easy to rationalize our own fear, greed, and anger by claiming they are God's will. In the 5 centuries after Jesus' crucifixion, Christian ethics took a back seat to politics. As the church became the religious arm of the Roman Empire, church fathers emphasized authority. And I've talked about this before. St. Augustine developed the doctrine of original sin to claim that humans were so corrupt by nature, we could not do anything good on our own. The highest human good to him was obedience to the church-state combination. They were both about the same thing in 500 AD. In other words, the doctrine of original sin really was developed to keep the masses in line. You can quote me on that. 1,000 years later, Martin Luther still worried more about obedience to authority than about the challenge of the Beatitudes. A much later German theologian, Ernst Troeltsch, about the early 1900s, suggested that the American Revolution never would have happened had our founders been German Lutherans instead of English Calvinists. But as Germany became a modern nation in the late 1800s, Germans became fiercely nationalistic, and that included Germany's churches. As Prussia developed into the German Empire, German churches strongly supported German militarism. By the First World War, every German soldier's belt buckle was inscribed with the words, Gott mit uns, God is with us. And when Germany lost that war, the government collapsed and the church lost a lot of prestige as well. And for some, German Lutheranism became all but irrelevant. And that was the world that Dietrich Bonhoeffer grew up in. Despite the German Lutheran Church's missteps, in fact, partly because of them, he decided to study for ministry. His doctoral dissertation was hailed as a masterpiece. It called for a reformed Lutheran church in tune with the real needs of real people. And he believed that when governments or churches claim that God is on our side, that is nothing but blasphemy. It reduces God to a mere tribal deity. And he wrote that even when communities split, Christ is not divided, close quote. And then he crossed the Atlantic Ocean to attend Union Theological Seminary in New York. There, his instinct for justice and activism was honed by some of the same professors who later taught Martin Luther King. And he also attended New York's African American Abyssinian Baptist Church, where he developed a taste for gospel music. To most German Lutheran clergy, though, what Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount was just too difficult for human beings. The Beatitudes were only supposed to show how hopelessly corrupt and in need of salvation we were. But at Union Theological Seminary, the Beatitudes became Bonhoeffer's favorite passage, the guide for how a faithful Christian should behave. To put it in the words of Unitarian Universalist theologian James Luther Adams, Bonhoeffer was seeking a religion of Jesus, not just a religion about Jesus. In other words, more than worshiping Jesus's image or name, Bonhoeffer wanted to live in a way that brought Jesus back to life through just and courageous action. And that was difficult in 1930s Germany. Economic unrest destabilized the Weimar Republic, and of course, when it fell, Adolf Hitler swept into power. Hitler talked a lot about God. He said that God had great plans for Germany under the helm of a strong leader, blessed and ordained by God, namely Hitler himself. Bonhoeffer's religion set him on a collision course with Hitler's Nazis, and it didn't take long. 2 days after Hitler's inauguration as chancellor, Bonhoeffer delivered a radio speech in which he called Hitler a misleader rather than a leader, because the Führer had set himself up as an idol. Nazi officials cut that broadcast off before Bonhoeffer could even finish, but he had made his point, and he had also gotten his name into government file folders all across Germany. As an example of Hitler's real attitude toward religion, Hitler once told a staff member referring to a certain class, a certain category of people, quote, "You can do anything you want with them. They will submit. They are insignificant little people, submissive as dogs, and they sweat with embarrassment when you talk with them." And no, that statement was not about Jews. Hitler was talking about Protestant ministers. And sadly, most of Germany's ministers proved Hitler correct by siding with Hitler against Bonhoeffer. Hitler set up what he called the United Right Church. Pastors were required to swear a personal oath to Hitler, which is, I might add, pretty much what Christian nationalists today are doing, waving guns and supporting the most reactionary political candidates. And one thing that this shows is that the Holocaust and World War II were not just Hitler's fault. He had plenty of support among uber nationalistic religious Germans. the swastika joined the cross on the altar, and they adopted what was called the Arian paragraph into church creeds. The Arian paragraph denied church membership to anyone of Jewish ancestry or anyone who was married to a Jew. A few clergy, including Bonhoeffer, did rebel, and they formed what they called the Confessing Church. Bonhoeffer wrote a pamphlet titled The Church and the Jewish Question. And it shows Bonhoeffer as a product of his time. He did agree with the traditional doctrine that Christianity had replaced Judaism as God's chosen people, and he did believe Jews would ultimately be reconciled with Jesus as the Messiah. But he also saw the persecution of Jews as abject evil, comparing it with the treatment of blacks in the United States as abject evil. Seeing Germany's moral collapse as an affront to God, he wrote that it was every Christian's duty to fight government injustice in three ways. First, it was a Christian's duty to question the state and call it to account. Second, it was a Christian's duty to help the victims of state injustice, whether they were Christian or not. And finally, it was a Christian's duty, quote, not only to help the victims who have fallen under the wheel of injustice, but to cast oneself into the spokes of the wheel itself, close quote. To Bonhoeffer, it was Christian duty to actively resist the Nazi government's injustice on every level. And as an atheist, this makes me want to ask my fellow atheists and myself what our atheism means. It strikes me that atheism, if it's to be religiously conscientious, must also lead us to real practice in the real world, no less than Bonhoeffer's Christianity. Otherwise, what value does our proclaimed reason and skepticism hold? Of course, the Nazis were not about to put up with that kind of talk. They closed down the seminary where Bonhoeffer taught. They banned him from teaching at all, so he taught illegally, in secret. In 1938, evolving on the Jewish question, he began to describe church und synagogue as being equal in the eyes of God. And on hearing that, the Gestapo banned him from any public speaking at all. Friends urged him to return to the United States for his own safety, and he did go, but he didn't stay long. He was sure Hitler would fall, and if he didn't stay with Germany during her time of suffering, he believed he would have no right to a voice once Hitler was gone. And he returned just as Hitler was invading Poland and kicking off the Second World War. Incredibly, Bonhoeffer's overseas connections helped him obtain a position with the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence agency. By that time, top Abwehr officials had turned against the Nazis. With top-level security clearances, they knew what atrocities were going on in conquered lands, which the public didn't yet suspect, and that disgusted many Abwehr officers. So Bonhoeffer actually fit in quite well. Meanwhile, Bonhoeffer was also falling in love with a vivacious young woman named Maria von Wedermeyer. They grew close and then decided that as soon as the war was over, they would marry. They got engaged. Till then, Bonhoeffer would use his overseas connections to ask foreign governments to help overthrow Hitler. And this caused a real struggle with Hitler's conscience. As a Christian, wasn't he supposed to be a man of peace? How could he be sure he was doing the right thing? And he finally decided that as a mortal human, he would never have the comfort of certainty. He could only act as his conscience told him to actively oppose evil. Hitler had to go. Unfortunately, by 1943, England and the United States had already decided that Germany had to be totally defeated. The plot to eliminate Hitler would leave the German army intact, and moreover, Allied intelligence had learned enough about Hitler. They realized that Hitler was incompetent as a military leader, and they believed Germany would lose the war faster with Hitler in charge. So, Allied officials listened politely to the plotters, but gave them zero help. Bonhoeffer also joined a group smuggling Jews out of Germany, giving them forged documents and money for transportation. But the Gestapo had been watching. They traced the money back to Bonhoeffer, and in April of 1943, they arrested him and several other people. He was subjected to brutal interrogation and torture that went on for months. And it was Bonhoeffer's religious faith that gave him the strength and discipline to keep his head up and keep resisting. Not only did he reveal nothing, he found ways to continue his religious writing, smuggling letters to family and friends. After 3 months, his jailers allowed his sweetheart Maria to visit him. They didn't tell him she was coming until she was already at the prison, and then guards brought him to a drawing room where there was a small couch. They let him in at a door on one side of the room, and she entered through a door on the opposite side. And the guards told them to sit on the couch, but they could not touch one another, and no whispering was allowed. They had to speak loudly enough for the guards to listen in. After a half hour, the guards told him the visit was over. They led Bonhoeffer back the way he had come, and another guard escorted Maria. Damn it, this always gets me. Escorted Maria in the opposite direction, and just as she reached the door, she wheeled, broke free from her guard, and before anyone could stop her, ran to Bonhoeffer, threw her arms around him and told him how deeply she loved him. And then the guards pulled them apart and took him back to his cell. And they never saw one another again. Through the winter of 1944 and 45, Allied armies advanced toward Berlin from all directions. Everyone knew Germany had lost the war by that time, but Hitler's generals were more terrified of Hitler and the Gestapo than they were of the Allies, so they fought on. In Poland in the east and Denmark in the west, Allied forces began to discover the concentration camps, shocking the world with the horrors they revealed. And in April 1945, with Allied victory just weeks away, Nazi leaders issued orders to speed up the execution of political prisoners. And on April 9th, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, along with Germany's intelligence chief, Wilhelm Canaris, and several others, were taken outside, stripped naked, and hanged. His last words were, "This is the end, but for me, the beginning of life." Now, some people say that Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a failure. And in some ways, I suppose that's true. He and his cohorts were unable to stop Hitler. He couldn't even convince many of his fellow clergy that Hitler's injustices were a serious problem. But then again, even if he did fail, at least he stood against an overwhelming flood of evil. Too many others simply allowed that evil to wash freely over his country. And you could even argue that Bonhoeffer failed exactly the same way Jesus himself failed. The Beatitudes are arguably the most brilliant piece of ethical theology in the Bible, but few people, even few Christians, really try to put them into practice. Proclaiming Jesus to be God is infinitely easier than living with the love and self-discipline that Jesus asked us to practice, which is, I think, exactly why Christian fundamentalism is so much more popular than more thoughtful kinds of Christianity. It's easy to worship Jesus and call him God. It's hard to live the way he tried to teach people to live. And at the same time, I think, Bonhoeffer's life also illustrates how serious a mistake we Unitarian Universalists make when we try to paint all Christians with that same broad brush. And I think I need to mention that as well. It is the fate of all human beings to live through difficult times when we're challenged to stand for ethics in the face of evil, nor is it given to us to control the great stories of our times or even know the outcomes of those stories. But atheist though I am, I agree with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. If we are to be fully human, then it is our call in the big picture to struggle against the shadows that close in around us. He saw the ancient Christian worship tradition as bankrupt. His religious faith called him to see God in every person, to strive toward the best that's in human nature, and to act against human injustice, even at peril of his very life. That was his religion. And I would like to be able to claim some of that as my religion as well. I hear a lot of talk about how different atheism is from theism, but here's a thought. Atheism and theism are separate when they're both being weak. They are not separate when they're both being strong. In other words, by itself, the most fervent belief or the most skeptical non-belief by themselves are just self-indulgent wind. What you do or don't believe doesn't mean much until it starts to challenge and change our lives. When our ideals call us to commitment to join paths with the oppressed and miserable, and then that supposed separation vanishes. Christianity and atheism become one, and times of the greatest challenge become times of the greatest hope. Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Christian courage gave him the strength to live his ideals in the face of intimidation, torture, and in the end, a horrible death. It carried him through suffering with humility and good humor, even when all practical hope was lost. And I have to say, a religious faith that does that is the real thing, whether I agree with the details or not. And I hope that if I ever face the challenges Dietrich Bonhoeffer faced, my ethical faith will do as much for me as his did for him. Amen. May it be so.